So without further ado, let's go ahead and start our afternoon session. I am delighted to introduce Kristina Kwacz, who's an alumni of SUNY Empire State. I hope I said that correctly. I'm going to turn the floor over to her and let her tell you about herself and her presentation.
Okay, thank you, Kim. First of all, can you see the slide presentation, and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. It's been a while since I did a screen share. I'm on Zoom all the time, but I feel kind of like Bill. This is rusty. So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all had a good break and a good lunch. And I really want to give a thank you first to the AGLSP board and staff for this opportunity, for this really unique CODA to the San Antonio conference. And just a shout out to Kim for being a great help when my plans changed and had to withdraw. And wow, this is a wonderful opportunity. So the title of my presentation today is Power, Propaganda, and Putinism, Lessons from the Stalinist Era. On February 24th, 2022, President Vladimir Putin addressed the Russian citizenry to explain the special military operation he had authorized in Ukraine, namely airstrikes and a ground invasion toward parts of the Donbas region, as well as Kyiv and Kharkiv. He stated, the purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetuated by the Kyiv regime. To this end, we seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The current events have nothing to do with a desire to infringe on the interests of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, he added. They are connected with defending Russia from those who have taken Ukraine hostage and are trying to use it against our country and our people. He vilified the United States and other members of NATO, claiming that focused on their own goals, the leading NATO countries are supporting the far-right nationalists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. A passionate close conveyed that this effort is for the good of the Russian people and they are all in this together. Quote, we all know that having justice and truth on our side is what makes us truly strong. If this is the case, it would be hard to disagree with the fact that it is our strength and our readiness to fight that are the bedrock of independence and sovereignty and provide the necessary foundation for building a reliable future for your home, your family, and your motherland. I watched news reports of the invasion and then the throngs of people flooding the borders of Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, and especially Poland, mostly Ukrainian women and children simply seeking some form of safe haven. Homes and livelihoods and normalcy left in their wake for an undetermined time, an uncertain future because of a violent and senseless interruption. I thought of my extended family and what were the eastern borderlands of Poland in 1939, and how on 17 September, the Red Army claimed those lands for the Soviet Union because of a pact forged with Nazi Germany. Propaganda, even on postage stamps, claimed that the Belarusians and Ukrainians in this region were now liberated from the oppression of the Poles. I thought to myself, everything old is new again. So the theme of this conference, Biblioteca, reading the past, performing the present, writing the future, resonated. My research to date is focused on the Second World War and the Stalinist era, but the war in Ukraine inspired another look at Soviet propaganda. Today, I'm going to give a very brief overview of one of the key tools used by the Soviets to convey messaging to the population, poster art. There are 5 periods of Soviet propaganda art: the Bolshevik era, new economic policy, first and second 5-year plans, the Second World War or Great Patriotic War, as it's known to the Soviets, and the Cold War era. I'll present just a few examples of posters from 3 of these periods: the Bolshevik era, skipping to the 5-year plans, and then end with the Great Patriotic War. I will say that I scooped most of the poster images from the International Poster Gallery, which sells original works to collectors, often for thousands of dollars. They have a really interesting inventory, and it's kind of fun to scroll through. I learned that the Bolshevik era is important to include because this is when the propaganda poster began to be used extensively. Victoria Bonnell writes, the critical issue facing the Bolsheviks in 1917 was not merely the seizure of power, but the seizure of meaning. How best to convey that meaning, the messaging, to the Russian people. She observes the low level of literacy in the country and strong visual traditions contributed to the birth of poster art. Practicalities of production also weighed heavily as the revolution and civil war disrupted the printing industry. So limited resources such as paper and ink could reach more people if used to produce media such as posters. Here's the first poster. It's by Dmitry Moore and states, have you enlisted in the army? So the factory in the background indicates that this message is directed to the Russian worker as the Red Army soldier is recruiting forces to defend the October Revolution against the whites. In another poster by Moore, it's celebrating the 3rd anniversary of the revolution. The banners read, "Workers of the world unite and forward to communism." On the chopping block is General Wrangel, the final commander of the White Army. A worker wielding a hammer and a soldier with a bayonet are ready to execute him, symbolically destroying the old to bring forth the new world order. And finally, an example of the identification of enemies. The kulaks were prosperous farmers identified as class enemies of the poor peasants by the Bolsheviks. The priests and White Army were also considered enemies, and the three appear time and time again in various incarnations as symbols of the old order to be destroyed. Next, to look at the first and second 5-year plans. The USSR is the shock brigade of the world's proletariat. What's a shock worker? The shock workers were workers who fulfilled above and beyond their work quotas. In this poster, the man's powerful stance, the size of his outstretched arm, the banner planted on the globe, and the admiring and appreciative looks of the other nationalities convey the Soviets' global leadership in worker output and also their dominance in production. Here, the main message is peasant, fight the kulaks. So Stalin also labeled the kulaks as class enemies, so their farmland could be incorporated into the collectives, bringing agriculture under state control. Here, a farm worker is clutching the clawed hand of a kulak who is trying to steal his work. If you look carefully, that's the output, clearly the very successful and abundant output of the collective farm. So the collective worker is guarding that from the greedy hand of the kulak. And the vast output of the grain conveys the success of collectivization. Also, a key series of photos, posters during this period conveyed Stalin in a fatherly view. Anita Pish writes, one of the propaganda strategies employed by the Soviet regime, Stalinist regime, was to depict in posters a happy socialist childhood as if it already existed. Stalin appears as a father figure in these posters, suggesting he is the father of all children in the nation. Here, the children that are most engaged with him are the boys. There's a young boy with a boat. Another one is with the plane holding his arm aloft. Another one is a drawing of the Kremlin. The girls are a bit more passive. the one extending an outreached hand, the other is holding flowers. The interesting point is the presumed mother figure is standing behind Stalin, so she's taken a secondary role, and Stalin is really the dominant force in the poster. And now a few images from the Great Patriotic War. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, propaganda was produced to motivate men to defend the nation. Here we have a symbolic depiction of the motherland as a new Soviet woman. Druckland and Zegers write, possessing a stout physique capable of withstanding the rigors of maternity and physical labor, she extends a soldier's oath in one hand while summoning forth soldiers behind her. So again, very powerful, the colors of red, the red attire, the number of bayonets behind her indicates the growing force of the army. Here, another of the strong women, again in red, clearly working the collectives. She has a very abundant sheaf of wheat over her head, and she is shaking it, and the allegory is it's raining bombs onto the Nazi aggressors. So the messaging is, let's deal the enemy a blow with Bolshevik harvesting. Okay. Better an honorable death than a shameful life. Here, Russian soldiers leap across a gully with their bayonets fixed while fires are raging in the distance. The flattened decorative frieze of 14th century cavalrymen carrying scarlet shields hovers above and behind them, bearing a banner that reads, "Be afraid not of death, but of defeat, as it will bring both death and humiliation." And finally, we place all our hope in you, Red Warrior. This poster conveys terror. It features a young woman in captivity with other civilians. She desperately clutches the barbed wire, but is of course unable to escape. Behind her, civilians are being executed at point-blank range by a Nazi soldier. She recognizes that perhaps in just minutes, this too will be her fate. The exhortation, "We place all our hope in you, Red Warrior," aims to motivate Soviet troops as the future of the motherland lies within their hands. And again, the woman in red, conveying the message of the motherland. In a sobering article in The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum compares the vilification of present-day Ukrainian citizens to that of the kulaks during the 1930s. She asserts that instead of declining, the Russian state's ability to disguise reality from its citizens and to dehumanize its enemies has grown stronger and more powerful than ever. She notes a critical difference, however, for instead of offering its citizens a vision of utopia, it wants them to be cynical and passive. Whether they actually believe what the state tells them is irrelevant. Although Soviet leaders lied, they tried to make their falsehoods seem real. How the future of today's war will be written remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristina. That was wonderful, and those images were just incredible. Does anybody have any questions for Kristina? Please just chime in. Don't have to use the chat or raise your hand.
I noticed one of your posters was not in Cyrillic, and you had said that you collected those images from a site that sells them. Does the site verify that the posters are authentic, and do they go through that kind of checking before being put up?
That's a very good question. I would venture to say, yeah, I feel really confident, but good point. I
May I
had
ask
to
a
edit
question?
out about 5 of them that, we could have gone into like post-war era, and it just was too long and too much. And finally, I focused on these that really pertained to, for me, it was most important to convey the messages of vilification of various groups of people, and senseless brutality.
May I ask a question?
Hey, Braden, go ahead.
Hi, I thought that was a great presentation. I was wondering if you saw in the the Bolshevik propaganda, if you saw using animals to depict their perceived enemies. I've seen a lot of that in 20th century propaganda art. The regime's perceived class enemies, race enemies, a lot of that. I was wondering if you saw that with the Bolshevik art too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a really terrific resource is, I will get my reference, is Victoria Bonnell's Iconography of Power. And she really looks at the whole range and goes quite in depth, even looking back to the origins of visual art pre-Bolshevik era, and the changes from religious art to then the messaging by the state in the various iterations, and absolutely animals, and especially during the Great Patriotic War, caricatures of the Nazis. This could have been an all-day presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Kristina?
I'd just like to ask if you're seeing anything similar right now in terms of posters used to explain or encourage patriotism in Russia in the USSR in Russia about the Ukraine conflict.
I have not, but I think it's with technology, it's a totally different climate, and you have trolls and bots and a whole different way of communicating to the public. One of the interesting points that Applebaum makes is that on Soviet media talks very little about what's going on, or Russian media talks very little about what's going on in Russia, but they really focus on what's going on in other parts of the world, what's going on in the United States, in the UK, and all of it's bad. So their perception, the perception of the Russian people is that, wow, we really have it great here, because elsewhere things are really, really dire, and the people are awful, and it's really easy to vilify them then. That's my extreme simplification. Her article in The Atlantic is absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.